I'd like to seize this moment to introduce commissioners here present to you, following which you move into your presentation. At the right end of the panel is Commissioner Sheikh Kafuma Kone. Next to him is Commissioner Per Brown Bull. Next to her is Commissioner Umusila. At my immediate left is Commissioner Massa Washington, followed by Commissioner John Stewart, and then Commissioner Gerald Coleman. I'm Jerome Verdier. You may proceed. There's a podium at your left if you choose to use it, or you may remain seated. You kindly say a little bit of your public life and then move into them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank you and the members of the Commission for the work that you are doing. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, fellow Liberians. A little over 5 years ago, at the instance of ECOWAS, and with the support and participation of respected members of the international community, the government of Liberia, other belligerent forces, along with political parties and interest groups of the country, were represented in Accra, Ghana, to negotiate a path to ending the longest and costliest conflict in Liberian history. Over the course of 23 years, our country has sailed tempestuous waters amid the precarious cycle of violence, tenuous peace, no peace, no violence, back to violence, tenuous peace, and no peace, no violence. At the time of the Accra meeting, the mood of the country could not have been bleaker. The country was yet again entrapped in another phase of violence. The government was without effective control. The amphitheater of the war had been moved from the interior to the capital, and the insurgent groups were increasingly demonstrating their capacities to threaten the seat of power and oust the government. Bodies littered the streets as rackets reigned on the ravished capital. Naturally, every successful advance on the capital increased the morale of the insurgent groups as those of the governments waned. Also on the quick spiral downward was the faith of the people in their government to deliver on the promises of peace, security, stability, and protection. For many Liberians, the light of day and the dark of night indistinguishably entrapped them in the debilitating realities of more deaths of families, friends, and loved ones, more fear of the fighting forces, more violence creeping ever closer to their homes or places of refuge, more despair that the future presented nothing but bloodletting, misery, and anguish, and of course, more hunger for food, security, and peace. Unsurprisingly, as Monrovia and the country burned, beneath the overcast of billowing smoke spawned the marauding flames of lawlessness, hopelessness, and anarchy. Liberia, the proudly proclaimed affirmation of the capacity of men of color to govern. Liberia, the lone star whose trailblazing and scintillating light radiated a tale of hope, freedom, and redemption for a continent yet shackled to the frightening darkness of servitude, colonialism, and oppression. Liberia, the sanctuary for the oppressed and a refuge for the weary. Liberia, the voice of the voiceless, had collapsed under the increasing weight of its own contradictions, the folly of its political and economic malpractices, and the growing pains of what can best be described as Ostrich Syndrome. Now, an ostrich is said to possess the unique curse of being unable to see itself by burying its head under its wings or in the sand. It is said to be so engaged not only to rest but also to hide from predators. The sad truth of the ostrich is that not only is it unable to see itself, but also unable to see, appreciate, and understand its environment and the lurking dangers therein. When referred to people or their societies, it tragically portends the inability to honestly introspect, reflect, understand, appreciate, and adjust to the changing conditions and circumstances that attend their continued peaceful existence. At the meeting in Accra, quite naturally, the deteriorating situation at home will not allow for the much needed reflective conversations on all of the attending causes of this phase of violence. Accordingly, the understandable imperative was to bring the deaths and destructions to an immediate end, with the hope that that will provide the needed space for national introspection, reconciliation, and healing. Out of this school of thought sprang the concept of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But this was not the only school of thought prevalent. Proponents of a tribunal before which participants, sponsors, and or former combatants of the war will be brought to answer to charges that will be raised as a consequence of their roles, argued famously that there will be, quote, no peace in Liberia without justice, end quote. Admittedly, there were and may still be merits to this school of thought. The problem at the time, and I should say one of the problems at the time with this proposition, was that the conference, challenged by limited resources from the international community, was presented with an either-or proposition. Either a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a tribunal. I felt then, as I do now, representing the government of Liberia, that the justice of which these advocates spoke, while seeking to penalize so-called actors, had the troubling potential of obscuring the underlying causes of the war and tragically misdirecting the attention of the nation only to its effects. I must admit, I also found it difficult to believe that we will find jurists, unbiased and pure enough to pass judgment on others over their participation in a conflict that had so engulfed and enveloped the entire nation. I was unconvinced that merely sentencing one or the other to death or life imprisonment will not answer the persistently nagging questions of how Liberians, notwithstanding the guise of war, succumbed to the basest forms of human savagery and degradation. What wrongs did the war purport to make right? Was war a final or only available alternative to right that wrong? Has the wrong been righted? Why was being born into one tribe or the other considered a mark for death? What spurred such unrestrained and repressed anger of one Liberian toward the other? Why did neighbors have so much food stored up while their friends died next door of hunger? How did an otherwise peaceful sovereign, at least up to then, that is what we thought Liberia was, slip into such orgiastic frenzy of violence? How and why did we veer off the lofty ideals that nurtured the foundation of the nation? And how can we return to that stated aspirations for which this nation was founded? Accordingly, how can we as Liberians, own up to our history, experiences, and tragedies so that our posterity can be spared similar visitation? What can we do so that we Liberians can also proclaim with unrestrained conviction, abiding faith, and concerted voices at home and abroad, never again? That we can proudly and convincingly pronounce that these sad chapters and experiences are finally over. That never again will we or our children follow such paths. And that we will create for our children a new path that will lead to unity, peace, security, stability, and shared prosperity for all. Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, although important, the mere award of remuneration and apportionment of blames falls short, in my humble opinion, of equaling the true character and spirit of our process of national reconciliation and healing. Ours is a conscious attempt to help a troubled, internally inharmonious, and inherently contradictory nation find itself. It is this added responsibility which fundamentally distinguishes this commission from others of the world. I honor, appreciate, and respect the depth of deliberation and hard work that attended the process of lawmaking and the diligence with which you continue to go about its efficacy. I also understand the limiting scope imposed upon you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, by the enabling legislation which you have similarly sought to impose upon me in your letter of invitation. However, as I hope you will come to appreciate, there is indeed a nexus between our history and the challenges of our contemporary realities. To ignore this truth and be afraid of our past will impose upon us haphazard and band-aid approaches to the resolution of our problems. This will be the ingredients of another tragedy waiting to happen. Undoubtedly, you will succeed, as you already are, in modeling yourself with very little difference after similar commissions of Rwanda, Ghana, and South Africa. But sadly, in the end, our nation may be unable to find itself. Liberia, both in its history and in its character, is particularly unique. Too many lives have been lost on all sides by the quarrels inherited from our history. It is time to stop playing games and own up to those tragedies. I would therefore like to think that the invitation extended me by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is also a call upon ordinary citizens, leaders, students of history, and other intellectuals to add value to a process intended to challenge our better selves in the search for national renewal. No cost should be too high to give realization to this cause. My presence today is undergirded by such motivation. A hopeful return to the spirit of Accra and a reminder to you and through you to the nation, not just of your onerous responsibilities, but also of the dissimilar characterization by which this TRC is encumbered. But Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, I am also here to fulfill other obligations that I have. During the course of the last phase of our violence, the war, I entered by no design of mine into 3 pacts from which I cannot be easily extricated. The first pact I entered into was with a student of the University of Liberia. The bombing, the fighting had returned to Habel. I was at the time situated in Buchanan, Grand Bassa County. A former student leader and activist, it became clear to me that in more ways than I could imagine, I should share in the full responsibility of the war and would not allow myself to remain idle in Buchanan while others die. And so I took on a responsibility without any consultation with the leadership of the MPFL, to assist in the retrieval from areas close to the front line of civilians and wounded combatants, and take them and convey them to the hospital, the government hospital in Buchanan, Grand Bassa County, and or the hospital in LAC, the Liberia Agricultural Company. It was over the course of one of such exercises of conveying wounded people particularly. And at the time there were bombing raids in those parts of the country. And so you would drive with intermittent lights. You put your light on for a while, you shut it off for a while, just to be able to see and drive. Because if you put the light on too long, the possibility of being bombed from the sky was there. Driving from Cotton Tree to Buchanan in a bus full with wounded soldiers, I passed something that I did not recognize on the side of the road, in one of those flashes. And then someone screamed in the bus that I must have passed somebody lying on the side of the road. So I stopped, I backed up, and there was, in truth, a gentleman lying on the side of the road. I picked him up along with the help of others, put him in the bus. He was wounded. He had taken a gunshot into his abdomen. At the time I didn't know that, but we put him in the bus and drove him to the Buchanan General Hospital. The doctors came out, took out all the other people, but this gentleman's wound was so severe that they said he needed immediate operation or he would die. I was advised to take him to LAC Hospital. On the very bumpy road, this was about after midnight. I reached LAC Hospital and the doctors were all gone to bed. We woke them up and they were happy to receive somebody who was wounded and try to do their best to save his life. I decided to wait for word about this gentleman. I had taken a particular kind of interest because while others were making noise in the bus and screaming when I bounced in or cursing me because of the way I was driving, and that was not to be unexpected. But this guy was remarkably quiet. The road to LAC was harsh. And yet, with his wounds, he wouldn't cry. He wouldn't complain. He did not show the pain that he was in. So one of the doctors, after initial examination, came out. We were sitting outside and wanted more information from me. And I just said, look, I almost passed this fella on the side of the road and I picked him up. But I'm interested to know who he is. He's not complaining. He's not saying anything. Apparently he has taken his wound with such strength and character is frightening. In any case, the doctors informed me that the bullet that he took in his abdomen, and because of the duration of time it has taken him to move from where he probably took the wound to the edge of the road, had developed gangrene. And the wound was so severe that he needed immediate operation. He had lost so much blood. We went about with everybody in my presence trying to figure out who had the type of blood. I believe it was O or B they were looking for. I don't recall that very well. But in any case, I asked if I could see this man. And the doctors told me he had used rice bag and tied his wound, and the fibers of the bag also accelerated the deterioration. So I went in to see this person. I walked into the room, the makeshift operating theater, and this young man was still lucid. And as I walked into the room, he said, "Oh, Comrade Brown." And I was shocked. I walked closer to him and asked, "Do you know me?" He said, "Yes, I know you, comrade." I said, "Where do you know me from?" And then he said, "Oh, any of our leaders on campus." I said, "Are you a student of the university?" He said, "Yes. In fact, he was a member of my party, my student political party." And then, in a strange way, he convicted me even more. He said to me in Liberian parlance, "Bah, you don't let us die for nothing." I held his hand and promised myself and him that we probably will not. Of course, the doctors came in and I excused myself and they did their job. That young man expired at 5 o'clock, around 5 o'clock that morning. I went home extremely deflated. Not just for him, but for many others who believed they were giving up something, the only thing that they could have, the highest that they could put on the table, their lives, to create a better place. And he convicted me in a pact that has brought me here today. The second pact I enter is with a family whose name I don't know. A couple of friends and brothers and I decided we will use the opportunity of our presence in what people would call, was popular to call, behind the lines, to see Liberia, to see our country. All we knew of Liberia was Monrovia, where we grew up, where we went to school, where we had our friends. And so on one such expeditions, to Maryland, in fact, coming back, the pickup in which we were traveling failed on one of these difficult hills. And sliding backwards, ran into a ditch and somersaulted. God was good to me and my friends. Most of us came out of the accident without fatal injuries. Some were cuts and bruises, but nothing extremely fatal or life-threatening. In any case, The pickup landed at the outskirts of a footpath that led into the bushes. Here came out of the bushes this lady wearing what was left of a pair of slippers. And of course, dressed in garments that just didn't need washing, but that if she were to appear here today, most would think she was insane. But that was all that she had. We had nowhere to go. It was getting late and dark. She offered us her home. We went in there, and what it was comprised of thatch roof and makeshift facilities. The floor was of the earth itself, hard and black. She was smoking game that her husband and son and grandson, she said, had made available for their evening meal. So in their one-room hut was what could pass for their bed, a hard mash and thatched bamboo tied together. They had stuffed grass in sacks that they could find, and it comprised their mattress. And there they lie. And in fact, they offered that to us for the night. We must have been about 10 people. And she took some of her meat and cooked us food. Oh, she offered us the food in wares that you would think someone was crazy to eat from, but we didn't have a choice. We ate, we thanked her, and we slept. Water came from the running creek nearest by. We drank. At about 1, 2 o'clock that morning, the skies opened. Rain poured upon that hut like it was intended to teach us a lesson. We woke up because we needed to help patch the roof from inside. And 10 of us, including the woman, her husband, and the grandchild, we were not enough to patch the very porous roof. In any case, by morning, I contracted, perhaps because of the food, dysentery. I asked to use their toilet facilities. And she said to me, "Check go behind her." And in the pouring rain, I went under the tree and did the best that I could to ease myself. And this was over repeated joinings under the tree behind the house. Interestingly, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, by morning, we were able to fix the car. We were determined not to sleep there again. And we were about to leave. The husband, of course, before the crack of day was gone, but her grandson hung around. We didn't have money to thank her. We didn't have anything. Not that she probably would have used it anyway. To buy what? In any case, we offered to bring her son with us to where we were at the time in Banga, and promise to school him so that one day he can return to hopefully elevate them from that situation. The woman looked at me questioningly and with shaky voice, and you could tell the depth of her regrets, said, and this was interpreted to me, but she said in her vernacular, and it was interpreted to me by one of the ladies who could speak her dialect, said, so that bar I do for your accident, I brought you to my house, I gave you my food, and you won't take my son, the only thing, my grandson, the only thing that I have, you all want to take him. We tried to make the argument that keeping him with you is to consign not just you, but also him to similar fate. And unless and until we provided him an alternative, he will grow to know not what Kanta Kinte whispered what Kanta Kinte's father whispered in his ear at birth. Behold, the only thing greater than thyself. That if a child has no opportunity to be greater than the father, than the parents, not only is the country doomed, because that family is also doomed. That boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old. But by then, with a pants that barely covered his private parts, short trousers, no shirt, no slippers, he was an expert rat catcher. He could run through the bushes and bring home rats for the family's meal also. With that family, I entered another pact. And finally, the third pact is with my brothers and sisters who can no longer speak for themselves, but who voluntarily and involuntarily offered their lives for the cause of making Liberia a better place. I went behind the lines with friends and brothers that I had known from the level of the university and over the course of my life in Monrovia. I met and made friends with people I had not known. And together we share what we believe was a cause to right the wrongs of Liberia. What we believe was the only alternative available. Some of them, I can't help but stand in their shadows and today speak on their behalf and try to answer questions as to why we did what we did. Because I know if I had lost my life and they were spared theirs, they would do no less than stand not just before you. This is not about me, this is not about you, but through you and speak to a nation, believing that it should no longer pursue the paths and the conditions that led and predicated the war. And so, those are some of the reasons, Mr. Chairman, that I'm here today. Let me say, like some Liberians, while not minimizing the anguish of many, no one should be allowed to do so, I had begun to fret that the commission had become too mired in the theatrics of the war and may have forgotten to help the nation reflect upon other important questions of why we came upon such costly enterprise. And by cost, I don't mean necessarily in treasure, I mean in lives. The verdict is still out as to whether or not those initial anxieties of some Liberians may have been misplaced. Even so, there continues to be other concerns that militate against interested and resourceful individuals to participate in this process of constructive national dialogue. One such concern is that these presentations you have popularized same as testimonies will be treated with the seriousness that they deserve. Serious in depths, serious in reflections, serious in analysis, serious in outcomes, and serious in our commitments to pursue a resolution. It may prove unwise in the long arc of history to entreat these discussions, as we so often do in Liberia, with callous contempt, possessive of very little value, an opportunity to settle scores, and as usual, allow that the outcomes simply dust away in archives and libraries, undeserving of our collective attention and immediate action. My prayer is that these testimonies, to borrow your own popular characterization, will incite our national consciousness to confront realistically and steadfastly what we must today, so that our progeny can be assured of a better, more secured, unified, stable, and prosperous nation. Indeed, we cannot change the past, but we are wise if we learn not to repeat it. The zenith of insanity is to constantly follow the same path and expect to arrive at a different destination. I happened upon another concern when I shared your invitation and my decision to accept with some friends and members of my family. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to fear. I tried to understand their concerns. Perhaps the impression that an invitee or witness, as you prefer to call them, is being implicitly accused of bearing a higher degree of personal responsibility for the war, for which the invitation represents a path to exorcism, a soul-cleansing trial before the bar of a forgiving nation represented by otherwise morally superior, neutral, unbiased, and eminent jurists accounts for these reactions. None should pretend that ours is not a forgiving nation. Indeed, we are. However, it is particularly helpful to this process to realize that each of us hold biases and prejudices that are born from a combination of personal experiences and history. We are influenced by and see the world through the prisms of those biases and prejudices. we are apt to judge others by the measures of those biases and prejudices, albeit consciously or unconsciously. No one should be faulted for possessing biases or prejudices. They are unavoidably human. What we can be faulted for is the pretense under which we often wallow, that no such bias or prejudice exists to influence not just our worldview, but also our view of each other. What we can do is constantly remind ourselves of these biases and prejudices and try with unmerited difficulty to keep them in check. Even if we cannot keep them altogether in check, we owe it to ourselves in this process to minimally be self-conscious of their existence. Similarly, it is high time, Mr. Chairman, fellow Liberians, that all of us be awakened from the tranquilizing stupor known to often infest our national consciousness and rob us of the needed sense of urgency to tackle national problems, that the woes of our national calamities can be reasonably deposited at the doorsteps of one and or few individuals. The net effect of such miscalculations continue to be that we assign too much credit to those individuals than they actually deserve, while seeking to reduce the greater number of the population to the status of herds. A proposition that will neither provide us enlightenment nor point us in the direction of a much higher calling, which, for all intents and purposes, remains the challenge of mending our fractured body politic. This stultifying snooze with which we attend national problems has infused us with the misguided and malignant impression that the solution to our national malaise is to simply rid ourselves of those, quote, responsible individuals, and everything perceived to be wrong with the country will automatically become right, engendering further the, quote, they versus, quote, us, and, quote, we versus, quote, them mentality that, admittedly, may have served a purpose, but ultimately failed the state. We share in the problems and must accordingly share in its resolution. But first, we must seek to understand the problem. We cannot be expected to fix that which we do not know is broken. What is the real problem with Liberia? I have come to offer you my response to this question. As I do so, I am not deluded of the tendency and practice of, quote, good guys blaming, quote, bad guys for the problems of the country. Let me counsel freely that this is proving to be both self-deprecating and regressive. It often calls upon us to assign God-like status and qualities to our leaders who are mere mortals. It engenders an unwillingness to think freely and independently, irrespective of the truth that thinking and speaking freely are irrevocable rights of our citizenship. It provides justification, however feeble, to expressions of constructive criticisms only within the privacy of our bedrooms rather than the public boardrooms. And it generates energy for the expressions even within the hallways of power about, quote, their thing rather than, quote, our thing. His or her responsibility rather than my or our responsibility. It is time we be healed from the virus of the Ostrich Syndrome and summon the common will, borrowing the phrase, quote, to face ourselves and think, end quote. Accordingly, let me apologize in advance if you do not find my presentation particularly stimulating, because it is not flavored with accounts of cannibalism, contrivance, or battlefront antiques. Of course, these stories have their values. I am not sorry that mine is not a wowing anecdote of personal grandeur or heroism at the expense of others, nor will I allow myself to stoop so low. It is not a story of who shot whom in the course of the war. Not only are there many others who may be best situated for such recollections, and they do deserve their fair share of the national spotlight, I am convinced that the anguished majority is more interested in minimizing the blame game, synthesizing these stories, combining scene with the personal experiences of their leaders, and present the nation with not only an analysis of why these things happened, but also what can be done to undermine a recurrence. This, again, is neither to minimize the importance anyone may attach to the antecedents of the war. Indeed, wars have always ravished countries, decimated populations, and left burning trails of losses and anguish for both the victors and the vanquished. In fact, it is quintessentially because I assign the highest value and importance to never letting this country of ours slip back to the acceptance of war as an acceptable alternative that I have agreed to appear before you. Mine is therefore an honest and yet controversial attempt, even if I would say so myself, to elevate the discussions to a consideration of why we were at war and why it should not be wholly unreasonable to conclude that if we do not reshape in a constructive fashion the conditions precedent to the war, it will assuredly revisit our great-grandchildren, if not our grandchildren. I certainly do not expect concurrence and agreements on all counts of this presentation, but I can only share with you that which I know and believe to be true, and for that opportunity I am most grateful. Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, your letter of invitation notwithstanding, I feel compelled to dabble through history if I must justify my time here and the attention your platform has so graciously provided. I submit that some of the periods are without the bailiwick of your scope, as I tried to discuss earlier. But if the problems are to be fully understood, we must somehow avoid passing them as wholly isolated and present them in the proper context of history. We have to stop pretending that the house is clean by sweeping the dirt under the rug. It will not be buried there forever. This is the actual value to be gained from reflective national conversations. The historian Arthur James May suggests that, quote, great events do not occur overnight, end quote. According to May, they evolve, they snowball, gathering momentum until historians pen their final chapters. Interestingly, May reached this conclusion as he catalogued World War II. May's observation is also true about the Liberian situation. The Liberian War, which has rightly captured our attention, is a crowning event which was precipitated by snowballs as they gathered momentum over the course of Liberia's history. Not only do I believe this to be true, but also I am convinced that unless we muster the courage to look back on those events, and I dare say lost opportunities, with an openness toward fundamentally addressing sin, the full accounting of the Liberian War will be short-sighted and of little consequence toward impacting a truly durable, secure, and stable future for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Having covered all the bases as best as I could, now let me return to the fundamental question of what is the real problem of the country. Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, my fellow Liberians, the problems of Liberia are systemic and political. Systemic as to form and political as to character. Although we may wish it to be so, the real problems of Liberia are not personal. They are systemic. This is not to obviate the efforts by some to make them seem personal. Indeed, there have been conflicts between personalities that have tended to garner our collective attention. Lest we be confused, there have been and will continue to be disagreements, political, social, or economic, between and amongst various actors and groups. Maintained within the ambit of democratic precepts, such disagreements should be encouraged. It affords the democratic health and well-being of the nation. A psychoanalyst concluded that, quote, where all think alike, no one thinks at all, end quote. Understandably, each will present you a perspective tinted by their unconscious bias. However, irrespective of the ornaments with which we choose to adorn the problems in Liberia, it is in truth systemic and relates fundamentally to our long-held and decadent approach to the distribution of the wealth of the nation, which is the essence of power. It is about our political superstructure, in which is subsumed our economic structure. Contemporary and historical conflicting personages and groups are themselves victims of a decadent political system whose time for change had come. Admittedly, the birth pains have been excruciating and arguably unavoidable. I say that again. Admittedly, the birth pains have been excruciating and arguably avoidable. A change management expert advised that, quote, change while you can, or the change when it imposes itself will prove painful, end quote. Change, he rightly argued, is the only constant in managerial equations. Change will come whether we like it or not. This has been a hard lesson that I hope we have learned. Truth be told, our political malady did not simply arise overnight. They are deeply rooted in history. It begins with the inauspicious lack of a common Liberian identity. This is the boogeyman in the room. My fellow Liberians, no nation of the world has achieved sustained peace, security, and prosperity without first forging a sense of shared national identity, one that pervades an unwavering faith and trust in the shared destiny of nation building, one that bequeaths to each citizen the right to dream and aspire, and one that ensures that those individual dreams and aspirations are reasonably anchored in and can also be manifested. in the pursuit of the collective dreams, ambitions, and aspirations of the nation. Ask a number of Liberians what it means to be called a Liberian, and more than likely, you will walk away with unfulfilling answers. Ask about their tribes, and more than likely, they will answer with a little more clarity. In the elections of 1997, 13 political parties contested. By 2005, each tribe could boast of a candidate in the presidential elections. The national elections, at least over the course of its first phase, became a tribal contest. Some explain this as a glowing testament to the success of our democratic experiment. I beg to differ. This is the offspring of a political system intrinsically weakened by the lack of a common Liberian identity. The contemporary reality of appointments to and leadership in government is occasioned by unfailing patronage to tribe and or party. It is not a shock to the system after elections to appoint loyalists, friends, and those with whom we share abiding affinity, kinship, or tribal and or party affections, while we entreat others with suspicions, unworthiness, and the flick of the wrist contempt of being too disagreeable, unpatriotic, and undeserving. Presidents and ministers, not entirely of their own choosing, seem constrained to stack up the deck with their quote kind, more often than not at the expense of competence. Some even undertake extreme measures to convert public institutions to private tribal enclaves and political wards. This is the consequence of a political system that is dying from the lack of a common Liberian identity. Obviously, each tribe is beholden to a distinct set of values and mores, laws and customs, history and experiences, heroes and heroines, tongue, structures and aspirations. For purposes of political expediencies and parochial security, we insulate and isolate tribes within wards and enclaves that we label counties, with very little infrastructure worthy of such labels. We enroll their taxes and the endowments of their lands into building and refurbishing infrastructures that will make the central government, which is resident in Monrovia, and its inhabitants comfortable while they waste away in abject poverty, ever more suspicious of and angry with the state and all those they deemed to be attached thereto. The various ethnic groups sought these counter statuses not only because it had become fashionable, but also because it became their pathway to the centralized government by the added representations it afforded them, and hopefully the needed attention that such representation would derive for them. Under such conditions, a child cannot better the parent, and the Liberian state is perennially robbed of opportunities for its own regeneration and renewal. The growth and development of a nation critically resides in the opportunities for children to constantly better their parents. Absent this, the flames of frustration beget anger, which begets war, which begets deaths and destructions. Fellow Liberians, from Spain to Cuba, from Singapore to China, from the United States to France, from Ghana to South Africa, from Nigeria to Egypt, from developed nations to third world countries, A unified identity essentially envelopes the scattered and often disparate experiences of all of our country's inhabitants. This sense of common identity, this is irrespective of the number of ethnic groupings that make up the country. A sense of common identity belies the removal of advancing clouds of suspicion about the purposes of the state. This is usually accomplished by dedicated national programs to provide each citizen in ethnic groups with the assurance that the state's objectives of freedom and equal opportunities are available to all without favor. This is an historic imperative underlying all nations, most of which comprised larger tribal and subcultural permutations than ours. Yet, we remain a nation without an identity that is common to all. Consequently, Liberia essentially means not the same thing, if anything noble at all, to 16 Liberians of the 16 disparate subcultural nations. The net effect of this historical disconnection is to nurture a Liberian state whose citizens are beholden to the political, social, and economic hierarchy of self first, tribe second, and Liberia, if ever, last. This twisted hierarchy has been supplanted into our national consciousness from the foundations of the nation. How and why did this come to be? Indulge me in a quick historical analysis. The written history of Liberia is a remarkable account of valor and estimable fortitude. Unfortunately, it is also imbued with contradictions and the nourishments of sustained political and economic disparities, separations, exclusions, and divisions. All may recall that by 1822, the successful repatriation of free men of color by the All-White American Colonization Society, ACS, began a wave of settlement establishments that soon culminated into the Commonwealth of Liberia. Overwhelmed by the population of the various native subcultural nations, they comprised 95% of the population of the land areas referred to as the Commonwealth. The administration of the Commonwealth, to ensure its survival and curb rising internal threats from the natives, pursued an unwritten policy of maintaining and enhancing the separation of the natives. This was effectively the first major contradiction. The formation of the ACS was itself motivated by the expressed intent to separate freed blacks from their former white masters in the name of racial harmony. Here, it will be practiced under the historical apology of security that will over time foster the psychology of sameness made different rather than difference made same. This sociology of separation, pursued through means that were both economic and political, did not only ensure that the native tribes were separated from the settler group, but also that they remained suspicious of and separated from each other. Of course, this suspicion will be extended to the settlers and, quote, their state and, quote, their government. These native subcultural nations were allowed and encouraged to maintain their identities, subsist under their own set of laws, continue in the enjoyment of the structures and order of their individual governance, and pursue their various economic enterprises, which principally included farming, fishing, and trading in their games and wares. For a reasonable period, this policy, notwithstanding intermittent clashes with or between the tribes, the the Commonwealth and later the Liberian state succeeded in maintaining its internal security. But this policy was insufficient to insulate the Commonwealth from external threats. A threat from the British, who had long been engaged in commerce with the native kingdoms, coupled with the increasingly difficult financial position of the ACS and the refusal of the government of the United States to declare the Commonwealth its colony, combined to pressure the declaration of Liberia's independence. I respectfully submit that the journeys to these shores were not undertaken to establish a new independent state. The prevailing perception was that the newfound land would be an extension of the, quote, motherland. It would be and was governed by appointees of the ACS. Lieutenant Governor Roberts would be the first appointed from underground shortly after his predecessor died in office. Taxes and levies collected were swiftly remitted to the parent ACS to bankroll additional repatriations. Unless the incumbent died in office, the tradition would be continued with efforts to seek the tacit approval of the government of the United States for the administration of Liberia. It came to be expected as a fundamental element of our special relationship with the United States and subsequent diplomacy with the world. Interestingly, some of the meanings we now have for a number of state symbols, such as the flag, were thought through much later over the life of the new nation. Accordingly, the sovereign statehood that was announced was one still without a forward-looking policy and strategy to forge a unified country, one that will establish, pronounce, and supplant a new national consciousness and sociology, one that will pervade a sense of shared identity, shared destiny among the natives and settlers alike, one that will set the course for a commitment to a common patrimony, and one that will unshackle and replace the stronger bonds of tribal loyalties with love of country. Perhaps in compensation for this, the settler ruling class assigned themselves the responsibility of civilizing their darker-skinned native brothers and sisters. In essence, the natives had neither the reason nor the inducement to abandon their suspicions of the intentions of the state and ventured without the safe embrace of their tribes with the hope of truly becoming a Liberian. Of course, the name Liberia, the land of the free, became the name of only the land. To a native, Liberian and the advantages, privileges, and endearments that appertain thereto became the exclusive domain of the settlers. It described their way of life, their dreams, their aspirations, their religion, their experiences. A native had to earn the status of a Liberian, perhaps by that process of civilization, which effectively included taking on the character of the settlers, either by marriage or some form of other long-term association which will ascertain adequate acculturation and civilization. As such, the 95% indigenous population knew what it meant to be a member of a tribe. They had no meaning for what it meant to be a Liberian. While the settler told tales of experiences from Georgia, Baltimore, Virginia, and Barbados, the natives passed on stories about how their tribes developed, while the settlers told of the journey across the ocean and the emotions of beholding the green coast. The natives around their fires told of the epic stories of their warriors and their gaming exploits. The disparate identities also pervaded disparate systems of values. The social and political values of 16 subcultural nations and the settlers, the vestiges of mutual suspicions and separations, will be passed on to their succeeding generations and their heirs. Naturally, the natives receded into subservience and the isolated comforts of their respective tribes. Through a combination of rigid enforcement mechanisms and the award of tokens and largesse to their leaders, they learned to obey the edicts of the government and pay taxes not as a measure of responsible citizenship, but largely in exchange for peaceful coexistence. Symbols and artifacts of the new nation and government unsurprisingly spoke only to the experiences and realities of the antebellum American South. These were manifested in the flag, a dress code, an insistence on being called Mr., and even the Whig Party. Of course, the wheelbarrow, the shovel, and the ocean have an especially significant meaning for their placements on the seal of the Republic. Sadly, however, not only are their meanings not shared by all Liberians, but they also do not garner the same depth of emotions, respect, pride, reverence, and sense of oneness that all citizens of a state must experience when they come face to face with the symbols of their state. Today, most unfortunately, Liberia portends a different meaning and experience to each group, and yet the tragic truth is perceptible that little has been accomplished to seriously harmonize those experiences. But now you may be wondering, what has this got to do with the war? Believe me, it has got everything to do with not just this, but most previous wars and violence. Admittedly though, I have often labored under similar confusion. However, the more I have sought a deeper understanding as to what recently transpired in our country, the more my steps were redirected to the past. You see, with time, it became clearer that our search has to start at the beginning. It was at the laying of the foundation of the nation that our political, economic, and social systems were developed and subsequently passed to succeeding generations. Each succeeding generation learned from the previous and passed on the system, consciously or unconsciously, to the next. Our acceptance grew largely unchallenged that what had worked in the past will invariably work in the present and in the future. A la the maxim of so-called success breeding more success. Robert Marley was right when he warned with melodious insight that we must know our history to know our destiny. Indeed, I am proud of our history. However, my pride is insufficient to obfuscate the burdens of historical disconnections which haunt our body politic even today. Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, you will recall my conclusion set out at the beginning that the problem with Liberia is intrinsically systemic, manifesting deficiencies especially in the political superstructure. I began the defense of this thesis by drawing your attention to the appalling lack of a common Liberian identity and the troubling consequences it presents. I would now like to continue this discussion with a look at how the troubling consequences evolved, setting the stage for the coup d'etat of 1980 and the war that ensued 9 years later. The settled law of nature is the ultimate reaping of what one sows. I have argued that the seeds of exclusions, divisions, disunity, and separations were not planted by the settlements, but for reasons of political survival and economic security were encouraged, strengthened, and inextricably woven into the fabric of our political system. For more than a full century, we seem poised to accept this condition with an air of inevitability until 1943, when President Edwin Barclay opted to balk with the political trend and, arguably driven by other selfish motivations, maneuvered Willem Verkanarek Shadrach Topman to the leadership of the country. Topman would subsequently galvanize control of their party. I may have already contracted your disbelief as I continuously refer to very little efforts to harmonize the disparate experiences of the indigenous population. Worthy of serious mention are the 1964 grant of suffrage and the pronunciation of the unification policy. These efforts spoke critically to the inability of the nation to continue in peaceful existence unless and until all were assured of equal rights, opportunities, and protection under one sovereign rule. Abraham Lincoln, a former president of the United States of America, says it best that no nation can exist, quote, half free and half slaves, end quote. Liberia will similarly find it difficult to continue in peaceful existence with full citizens and half citizens. While these efforts are commendable, the foundations of the nation have become too entrenched in the politics of separation and exclusion to the extent that the serious changes that were necessary to ensure the actual unification of the country could not be realized. Some will forcefully argue that these policies, while expressly opening up the country and its administration to all, were neither altogether altruistic nor seriously intended to elevate the natives to full citizenship. They argued further that these policies, while offering the natives little access, actually engineered the consolidation of power at the levels of both the state and the True Whig Party by President William Tubman. You may know that by August of 1955, former President Edwin Barclay and others were working and forming the independent True Whig Party to oppose President Tubman. It is instructive to note that as political rifts deepen between the ruling elites, the smarter players recognize the need to rally the native population in their corner. And so, through their chiefs, on whom were lavished praises and favors, and with the help of agencies and institutions of the government, such as what was later formed as the Ministry of Internal Affairs in the Army, the natives, at least through their chiefs, began to taste of the enormous influence of the powers enjoyed in the name of the government. there were always reminders that it was not their thing. The formidable strictures of the single-party system provided backup insurance. However, naked power can be intoxicating, and avarice, greed, has been a weakness of all men. And so, notwithstanding the steady erections by the government and ruling party of prohibitive strictures, the more power the natives, largely through their chiefs, tasted, the more that they wanted. The once insulated shield of centralized dominion began to crack. Over the same period of the Tubman presidency, the political landscape will undergo an important and dramatic paradigm shift. The superior presidency was born. As one ruling elite outmaneuvered the other, ostensibly with the support of the populous natives, President Tubman will rally political and economic power almost exclusively to himself, as he grew to symbolize the state in both form and substance. The overpowering presence and ghost of Mr. Tubman will haunt successive administrations whose leaders will seek to model their styles, mannerisms, political influences, and conducts after him. During the 1960s, attributable in part to the influence of the American Peace Corps volunteers, Liberians, especially of native descent, increased their travels abroad, especially to the United States of America, where they beheld and experienced another world that was itself confronting challenges from a minority member of its citizenship who were demanding equal rights and opportunities as true measures of their citizenship. These Liberians returned home in the early 70s, emboldened by such enlightenment, and seemed determined to make their mark on Liberian history. As if to reassure themselves of the seriousness of their cause, they made it fashionable to emphasize their largely indigenous lineage by change of names and or pronounced de-emphasis of their heretofore known Western-oriented appellations. What they lacked in experience, they more than made up for in ambition. With their return, the political and social landscape will be dramatically changed forever. Mr. Tubman was dead. The returning Liberians will meet a more progressive and embattled president at the helm of Liberia's leadership. Mr. William R. Tolbert, claiming familiar lineage to both native and settler origins, had begun to part, both in form and in substance, with his immediate predecessor. Mr. Tolbert will garner the scorn, contempt, and disdain of leading members of his own party. Arguably, he envisioned change on the horizon and attempted to lead the country through a reformation. But there are other compelling arguments about President Tolbert's motives. Some argue that the internal power struggle necessitated by the death of President Tubman was challenging to President Tolbert. The argument is furthered that some believe that because of the overpowering presence of President Tubman, Talbot as vice president enjoyed a mere nominal role and accordingly did not even share in the highest echelon of power, and that there were others who believed they held more sway and influence in the true Whig Party and the country than even Talbot himself. Naturally, Talbot would try to seek to control not just the true Whig Party, but his own administration. He will announce and recruit young people he called his precious jewels, ostensibly to pursue his programs and ultimately take control of the true Whig Party. This was not expected to be accepted lightly by those who felt they also had equal powers, if not more, to President Talbot. While his reforms were unsettling, the ruling elites while his reforms were unsettling the ruling elites, it also troubled a number of native chiefs who perceived his denial of previous largesse and handouts as miserly. Many thought it foolhardy and self-serving that he would challenge the nation to feed itself. Those were not the only challenges that the president would confront. As he attracted the disdain of the ruling elites, perhaps in higher measures, he also contracted the derision of the returning intellectuals that the changes he spoke of and sought to deliver were too slow and not far-reaching enough. As he attempted to tiptoe through the delicate balancing act at home, he also drew attention internationally as he heralded a foreign policy of, quote, genuine non-alignment. At a time the world was fixated between the dominant forces of the East and the West. Heretofore, Liberia was known to be with the West. Domestic tensions reached a tipping point in April of 1979. The Rest Riot was the first serious mass action against the government. Monrovia stood still. For a while, the government teetered on the verge of collapse. Unused to any serious and open challenge to the government and the party, the ruling elites blamed the president for what it considered manifest weaknesses brought upon by his so-called reforms and interactions with the progressives. Some in the know have privately informed that requests were made of General Cowboy Johnson, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of Liberia, to oust Mr. Talbot. How much awareness Mr. Talbot had of these designs is uncertain. However, he turned to younger party recruits and cadres, his precious jewels, who seemed to share his vision for reforms and challenged them to assist. He would become increasingly isolated from the core of the ruling elites. The state came to experience a new, albeit narrowed definition of people's power. The government was in retreat, and its leader turned to a neighboring state for help. This will offer more fodder to his critics. The center cringed under the weight of the tension and eventually collapsed. 1 year later, after the rice riot, more than a century of one-party rule was overthrown with the assassination of President Tolbert. The Liberian army was catapulted into a new political role, and they brought their guns along. In the early hours of April 12, 1980, politics and violence had enjoined in an unholy and precarious wedlock. 17 non-commissioned officers announced the ousting of the government. They were all of the indigenous stock and firmly supported by the returning intelligentsia, who had now taken on the nomenclature of progressives. The native population overwhelmingly welcomed and cheered the coup. The ruling junta tried and executed 13 former officials, most of whom were of the settler descent, and announced the dawn of a new republic. These new rulers presented a tribal permutation that cut across the major subcultural groups of the country, which were otherwise unused to such power and unschooled in the business of statecraft. Each tribal grouping could identify a member of the ruling junta with whom they believed and hoped they would reliably assert a new claim on the state. For their part, the 17 invited in or sought the appointments of members of their respective tribes and the progressives to assist in the administration of the affairs of the state. While this held a certain promise for the natives, it was an altogether new experience. As already indicated, very little had been accomplished historically to encourage tribal amalgamation and cohesion. With little time, they would turn upon each other until the proverbial last man was left standing. Even more importantly, the progressives, sensing the opportunity for leadership and influence presented by the mediocre disposition of their military counterparts, intricately embarked upon personal journeys in favor of long-held presidential ambitions. The People's Redemption Council looked on perplexingly as the progressives mauled each other and tore the council asunder on arguments about which dominant international coalition, east or west, should sway Liberia's foreign policy. Paradoxically, the progressive had experienced two essentially dissimilar forms of leaderships under the two last presidents and seemed to think that power must rest only in a strong centralized presidency, minus which leadership was either insufficient or incapacitating. It should be easy to understand this position. One of the last two presidents had been assassinated, while the other loomed large in history. Ultimately, the progressives would checkmate each other and end up with neither leadership nor influence. Master Sergeant Samuel K. Doe, the leader of the military junta, will call upon older, calmer, and more experienced heads. These individuals will not only ensure the ostracism of the progressives, but also chaperone Mr. Doe through the traditional business of governance and power. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Doe grew stronger and increasingly confident. He enrolled more and more members of his tribe into the army, his base constituency, and strengthened his ties with the United States, who relished the rise of the natives and seemed prepared to excuse his faults and excesses as an inescapable element of the learning curve, not just for him, but also of the majority natives who were unused to statecraft. However, the consolidation of power was rocky and inexpensive, both for the hunter and the nation. As one member of the council or the progressives was expelled, the enthusiasm and faith of the other tribes in the government effectively diminished. The hunter leader grew increasingly beleaguered and relied predominantly on his tribe and the army for security, for comfort, and for support. Naturally, even for members of his tribe who were not direct beneficiaries of his rule, the perception gained currency that an attack on him amounted to an attack on his entire tribe. It should be easy to understand this. This did not start with President Doe. It is an historical legacy passed on from history. In 1985, on the heel of promised elections, the head of state, secured in the fortress of a military barracks, announced that he will contest the ensuing promised elections. He was petitioned by the Liberian military. The symbolism of the venue should not have been lost on intelligent minds. It is believed that both the announcement and the venue combined to effectively and defiantly respond to the civilian political leadership which comprised the progressives. Through both direct and back channels, the head of state had requested a secured exit from power. Mr. Doe and his associates were persuaded to believe that no such guarantees would be forthcoming. Two schools of thought exist for the failure to offer the guarantees. The first was that the head of state and his surviving colleagues had to answer especially for the deaths of the 13 executed former officials. The second was that Mr. Doe's popularity had diminished, and accordingly, he could not possibly win the ensuing elections and consequently was in no position to negotiate. The Master Sergeant and the National Democratic Party of Liberia will be declared the winner of the elections. The military celebrated and manifested an unusual presence at the announcement. The other participating political parties declared the elections fraudulent and a miscarriage of democracy. The progressives had fatally underestimated Mr. Doe and had been dealt a stunning blow. But this was not the only problem of the progressives. Mutual suspicions, which had always characterized the transactions and interactions of the progressives, will be escalated. Some of the progressives, led by Mr. Gabriel Bacchus Matthews, who were privately favorable to providing Mr. Doe the guarantees he had requested, broke ranks and not only declared their recognition of the government, but also announced their determination to become a loyal opposition. By this time, The other progressives who were crowding foul had already begun to recruit support in important capitals of the world in favor of annulling the results and or sanctioning the government. The rifts between the progressives deepened. To the chagrin and surprise of most, the United States declared the electioneering process and its outcome essentially a work in progress, which should be encouraged in lieu of the political situation in the region. For some, the die was cast. President Doe will not be removed by means other than that which will also involve the military, a staunch political ally. As the next elections loomed on the horizons, President Doe was again constitutionally qualified to contest. There appeared to have been a race to give realization to the proposition of an armed insurrection against the government. An abortive effort by way of neighboring Sierra Leone was led by General Thomas G. Kwiwonkpa, former commanding general of the armed forces of Liberia. As if in response thereto, Mr. Matthews will again sharpen the internal conflicts of the progressives and contract the ire of the government when he declared, in response to inquiry about the possibility for the conduct of elections in 1991, that elections will only be possible if Mr. Doe was president, and that cheating will lead to a bloodbath. Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, ladies and gentlemen, the problems of Liberia are many, but they are quintessentially political. On December 24 of 1989, the National Patriotic Front of Liberia attacked the sleeping town of Butuo in Nimba County and pronounced another effort to remove President Doe. The insurgency from neighboring La Côte d'Ivoire initially predominantly comprised natives of Nimba, the county from which General Thomas Kwiwonkpa hailed. The oddity of this reality further fueled the tribal feud that had by now taken roots between the opposing tribes that comprised Nimba and Grand Jede. The incentive of revenge, while particularly useful for the recruitment of individuals to such enterprises, threatened to overtake the avowals of the insurgency. Announcing the war, Mr. Charles Gange Taylor, the leader of the NPFL, asked Liberians to brace for a long and hard fight against the forces of the government. This will prove prophetic, more for reasons of politics than the actual fight with the armed forces of Liberia. The ranks of the NPFL swelled with doctors, teachers, lawyers, nurses, engineers, philosophers, politicians, students, and Liberians of all vocations and callings. They included elements of every tribe, religion, and creed. They included men, women, children, rich, poor, old, young, natives, Americo-Liberians, all came under one umbrella of the NPFL. Accordingly, the NPFL naturally will represent different things to different people. For some, it was a welcome outlet for the release, albeit violently, of years of repressed anger and frustrations. For others, it presented an opportunity to exact their revenge. There were others for whom the MPFL represented the opportunity to bring about the needed changes for the well-being of the country. And yet, for others, it was a vehicle to fulfill their aspirations. And there were those for whom the MPFL represented another critical chance to change the trajectory of the politics and sociology of the country. Accordingly, the MPFL will announce a policy to take Liberia out of Monrovia and announce a headquarters in Banga, Central Liberia. This time, the changes will come through a revolution. Each will use the MPFL to pursue their objectives. By July of 1990, the fighters of the MPFL were encamped about the immediate environs of the capital. And having received a petition from leading opposition voices based in Freetown, Sierra Leone, Mr. Taylor announced the National Patriotic Reconstruction Assembly government, of which he was head, and the names of some members of that government. Vacancies were left for the appointment of other individuals who had formed part of the civilian political leadership of the country and were not dispersed about the diaspora. The war appeared to be nearing a conclusion, or so it seems. But that was not to be. A number of extenuating circumstances will account for this. The first was that the speedy success of the war held dire consequences for the region and its leaders, most of whom had either acquired power through coup d'etats or had overstayed their stewardship of their countries. The overthrow by a ragtag and hurriedly trained all-voluntary force of a government which was buttressed by an entrenched and well-trained military presented serious reasons for concerns, not only for the trainers, but also for the region. Secondly, a host of progressives were pulling away because most had underestimated the resolve and capacity of Mr. Taylor to organize and defeat President Doe. Even more importantly, he was not their choice for leader of the country. The manifest fears and concerns of the region would be enjoined with the political interests of some of the progressives to catalyze a conference in Banjul, the Gambia, to encourage both the formation of an interim government and an alternative end to the war than that which had been offered by the MPFL in July of 1990. In August of 1990, the conference named Professor Dr. Amos C. Sawyer, leader of the interim government of national unity. The region accepted and received him with all rights and privileges appertaining to the president of Liberia. President Doe was captured and killed in September of 1990, and the war continued. The longer the war lasted, the higher the number became of principal players and factions. Each each will set their eyes and ambitions on nothing less than the Liberian presidency. ECOMOG, the regional peacekeeping force, often performed the conflicting roles of facilitating the peace on the one hand and the war on the other. Successive peace conferences within and without the region were held to carve out a resolution to the war whose purposes and actors will be changed by the time of the next peace conference. At these conferences, resolving the military issues was always easier and quicker than resolving the political issues. Mutual suspicions, real and imagined fears, memories of being double-crossed, and especially blind ambitions will combine to bedazzle these conferences. Growing out of these meetings was the concept of a Council of State and its multiple memberships. By 1997, elections were to be held to finally resolve the question of the leadership of the country and return SIM to full constitutional authority, or so it seemed. By all credible local and international accounts, Mr. Charles Gange Taylor of the National Patriotic Party overwhelmingly won the presidential elections. 6 years later, we will be in attendance in Accra, Ghana for another peace conference. Mr. Chairman, commissioners, fellow Liberians, earlier in this presentation, I stipulated that the problem with our country was political, and that if we reset the political superstructure of the country, a number of ancillary problems will be resolved. I also indicated that the problems were systemic and deeply rooted in history, and that actors around whose necks we will wish to hang rather exclusively the problems of the country are themselves victims of a decadent political system whose time for change has come. I have tried to persuade you that the native and settler divide remains the elephant in the room, and with its roots in history has tragically engendered an ill-fated hierarchy, an ill-fated sociology of self first, tribe second, and Liberia last. This is true principally because it has not fostered a sense of common identity among the population. I have tried to support those conclusions by a combination of synthesis and analysis, without much finger pointing, but based on private conversations, personal and professional experiences and research. Now, I offered a number of, there are a number of recommendations that I like to place before you. Beware that some of the recommendations are controversial and not altogether original. 1. Provide urgent attention to the forging of a common Liberian identity. A. Cultivating a common vernacular to be taught and spoken publicly. B. Commissioning the research of historical characters of the various tribes and subcultural nations, and their contributions to the evolution and survival of their tribes and the state, including important symbols and artifacts of the other tribes into the symbols of the state, harmonizing our dual system of jurisprudence. There cannot be two sets of laws under which a Liberian can seek justice. One for the natives and another for the educated. Strengthening tribal leaderships as vehicles for internal tribal cohesion and integration. Encouraging the regional approach to the integration and development of the country and the subsequent breakdown of restrictive so-called county borders. Stop maintaining tribes in counties that lack infrastructure, that can only be considered tribal enclaves, and encourage a regional approach so that we can foster and accelerate the process of integration. 2, we cannot fully undertake the required changes to our political system until we commit to changing the way we practice our politics. Our democracy will effectively be returned to the one-party system, if it isn't already, if we allow the ruling party to singularly benefit from the administration of the country while the opposition withered into irrelevance. A weak opposition is a threat to democracy. Accordingly, I propose the following. A, commit to a reduction in the number of registered political parties by a predetermined and agreeable standard to a minimum of 3 to 5. B, provide budgetary allocations for the support and viability of those political parties to include public funds for presidential campaigns. Again, I know that many of you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, have questions and may require further clarifications of these thoughts. To the best of my knowledge, and without, like I said, sacrificing others to make myself or others look good, and sacrificing the security of the state, I will do the best I can to answer most, if not all, of your questions. And for this opportunity, I am grateful, and I thank you for your patience and your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Witness, for your testimony, or if you like, your presentation. We appreciate that you have taken your time off to come and share these moments with the Commission and deliberated on issues that traces the root causes of our conflict. much of them being historical, I wish to emphasize that a more in-depth study of our history will be portrayed during these processes, more specifically next month, when we gather the experts, historians, who have done a lot of work on Liberian history. Also, you spoke of the early 70s and 80s era. We appreciate that also, but noting that the Commission has gotten involved, other actors who were leaders during those times, and they too will provide more in-depth into the details of what happened. But we appreciate the connection you've managed to have made, going back, predating our independence up to present. We hope also you will appreciate that commissioners may ask you questions of a particular era when you play leadership roles, when you were more active and all of that, just so we get a personal perspectives of what happened during that period. We also note also that you were modest in that, speaking of the different public roles you've had, the different associations and alignments. So I'd like to read out what we have here as your profile. You may correct us or affirm what the information is. You have been an associate member of the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, and then the Progressive People's Party, a member of the United People's Party, a founding member of the Student Integration Movement, University of Liberia, a one-time student representative of the University of Liberia Student Union. You joined the National Patriotic Front in 1991. You were a member of the LPRC, the Patriotic Reconstruction Government, Assembly Government, a founding member of the NPP, and a national political and security advisor to the NPP. That you were a representative of the NPFL into the TRA, the Transitional Legislative Assembly, Managing Director of the Liberia Petroleum Refining Corporation, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation during the last years of former President Taylor taking over from Morning Captain, a former Foreign Minister under President Moses Blah and the interim government of Judy Bryan. You were government chief negotiator at the Accra Peace Talks in 2003, and then security and policy advisor to former President Taylor. Restating, you were a member of a minister in the government of the MPRAG, and you represented the MPFL during several of the peace conferences. It is also our information that you are conversant with security and policy issues at stake during the civil crisis, and of course most of the political activities and the history of the MPFL and the activities of the government then. With that background, you have deliberated, and I'm confident commissioners will be asking questions. I hope I was right in everything I said.
No, you are not. Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, you asked me if you were right in all that you just said. You were not. I received your invitation in the United States to attend, to do a presentation to you, a thematic presentation. I believe you were interested in learning from my personal experiences. And I felt that I could contribute to a process that I supported in Ghana, representing the government of Liberia. So I didn't support it because of Louis Brown. I supported it because it was a position of the government. I came, and I'm sure you are aware that I paid my own way to come to participate in these discussions and presentations. And it's because I'm a Liberian. And I believe I have a share in the course of this process. But I have to do a bit of house cleaning with you, and then we can go into the question and answer. I don't take oaths lightly. The first is that it is a disservice to those who are being invited now or will be to develop a profile of those individuals that is not what they are, but based on gossip, rumors, street talk, unsubstantiated accusations. In your letter of invitation, you asked me to speak to you and through you on the 22nd of August. I came and started to think through what I wanted to talk about. You call it a thematic hearing. So what theme did I want to present you with? In any case, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I was offered Monday at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I got this call that a team of so-called investigators or inquiry people will come to present me with a profile. Now, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I received that team, and a discussion began. They read to me that list. My first thought was, a copy of my resume could have been requested, and I would have provided you, rather than arriving at information that are hopefully untrue, some of which are untrue. Some of the people here imagine. But that was not the most disturbing thing to me. When thematic discussions are underway, and they intend to have them take national characterizations, if an invitee, if the TRC wants to benefit from adequate and full disclosure, he who seeks equity must do so with clean hands. The TRC must itself conduct its business with full and adequate disclosure. What do I mean, Mr. Chairman? And this is not intended to do any indictment, but we got to do a bit of housekeeping first. I was asked about 10, I could see the investigators were a bit jittery and wanted to talk about LPRC last. Every time I said, what is it you want to know? No, let's talk about it last. So I said, fine, suit yourself. So when we came to LPRC, I said, what do you want to know? What do you know about $10 million loan from LPRC? I said, $10 million loan? Yes, there was $10 million loan. Right. So who took the loan? Me? Finance? LPRC? That's what we want you to tell us. Is that what I'm going to talk about to the commission? That's the basis for the invitation? No, but we want to confirm something. What? Is there an accusation on the table about me? No. Okay. But let me tell you what happened, Mr. Chairman. So, I said, oh yes, there was a $10 million loan from Tradefco and the government of Liberia. And they believed they had something to run away with. So they left. I did not come with a printer. So I said, look, I need a memory stick to copy what I want to talk to the commission about. So maybe the commission guy won't want to talk to me about, then the commission can talk to me about what it wants to talk to me about when I tell them what I want to talk to them about. Because you said you are invited to participate in a thematic discussion. Of course, you ask that I throw some light on my roles and everything else, which I'm prepared to do. So they came back at 7 o'clock. I said, oh, you guys have a memory stick. You know, I'm not done yet. I thought I would speak on the 22nd, so I'm going to just encamp in my room and try to finish up writing something, so at least I can make an appearance on Monday. So they came back with a memory stick at 7 o'clock. I put the memory stick in my laptop. I was in the room still. In fact, I was writing and editing. You know how these things work, writing and editing at the same time. So if I made some mistakes, I'm sorry. Help to correct me. But the memory stick, of course, they couldn't come into my room, so they sent it by my brother. I put it in the laptop. This was not just a memory stick, it was a recording device. So I said, look, I pay my own way to come. I don't want to belabor that point. But the fact is, I decided I would come. You owe me some modicum of respect, and others who may wish to appear before you. They alone don't have to take an oath for the truth. You have to show them that you are interested in truth. Not just wish hunting and waste of people's time. You want to record somebody, be professional. Say, Mr. Brown, can we record you and what you want to say to us? And then I say yes. And then you go ahead. And then I'm responsible for what I say. You want to trap me? But anyway, I look at the device. Interestingly, when I earlier asked for the device, it took time for them to say we get it. So anyway, when they came to say I put it there, of course when you read everybody who knows about computer, and I'm not as savvy as most people, when you put a device in, your computer will read the device and then the thing will come up, or the thing on the particular thing will come up. How could people make such elementary mistake? I put it there. That which you just read came out as my profile, but you didn't read all. You are being asked as a result of some kind of investigation that was never had to ask me a question about blood diamonds, about Mr. Taylor, correct? Isn't that there on that paper?
No, blood diamond, no.
I can bring my laptop and show you the file that I copied because my name was on it. I saw Louis Brown profile. They were asking me about blood diamonds. I'm a kind of and talk about blood diamonds. If I want to talk about blood diamonds, why don't I talk to the head where they get all the if I know, where they get professional people who've been doing investigation. That I came here to talk blood diamond business. Who blood on the diamond? And then Mr. Brown was in charge of security and know Mr. Taylor financial dealing, and he must be asked those questions. You are hiding behind what? I helped to create you. That's why I came, out of respect for that work that we and others did. Now I expect everybody to have agendas. I expect that. I'm not deluded. But I didn't come here to discuss blood diamond business. If you know somebody blood on the diamond and you know where he is, go to the Hague and testify. I came here for us to be serious. And I believe eventually we will be. Mr. Brown was in charge of Mr. Taylor's security, and he know everything, and ask him those things. It just came to me, and now on the paper, then I will go bring my own computer. Hey there. So why did your invitation not write me, specifically asking me to answer today, that I will write you in the name of full disclosure and transparency, and the moral high ground that the chair you now occupy provide for you? Why did you not do that to me? That's why people out there are scared. Let me tell you, yesterday I came here, I stayed in my room trying to write. Yesterday when they announced on St. Jackson and now Louis Brown said, you know how many calls I received? What did we talk? What did we say? People scared of the process. They think it's just about witch hunting. And when these kind of actions take place, it cements that impression. It reinforces that impression. That you're not really to talk about the seriousness of our problem or the seriousness about the issues of the country. You're looking for people to blame. That's what you're trying to do. And this is not what this process is about. Now, having said that, I am unafraid of defending what I and others did in this country. I'm unafraid. But you owe it to me. What you want to know, write me, tell me. I will tell you. If I don't tell you, then you say, oh, he's hiding or something. But those same boys, I've read on the internet a list of Liberians, mostly of the past President Taylor government, letter to finance ministry. They must review our taxes. TRC, Rating Finance Ministry, we want to know the taxes of Louis Brown, Kadiatu Fule, Julie Fagate, Bernard Yure, Cyril Allen, only past government official. Look, let me say another thing. While I have this opportunity, then I will deal with my profile. The United Nations passed a resolution on Sierra Leone and imposed travel restrictions on Liberian citizens because they were said to be associated with or involved in the conflict in Sierra Leone, and unless their movement were constrained and restrained, the war in Sierra Leone will not end. The Sierra Leone people declared their war ended. Those who are there seeking those restrictions have retired and gone out of their own country or doing something else. And those Liberians have not been given an opportunity to answer to why they still wallow under restrictions, rights of Liberians to travel. You don't think it's to exact anger and suspicion of the intents and motives of the government for them? So I come and say, I want to bring a a dialogue to the table so we as brothers can reason again together. Then some people behind him tried to find, and if it were even true, people would think it reasonable. I want to ask now you, through you, the country, what will happen if these individuals decided tomorrow morning that they were going to Rabat International Airport and with the Liberian passport they will boldly and they will travel? What will happen? Of course they will be arrested. What will happen in this town? All walking around like we see things. What will happen? Their movement still constraining the Sierra Leone conflict? Is there a conflict in Sierra Leone? But let me come back to this. Mr. Chairman, every Liberian must feel a shared ownership of this country and must feel that they have an opportunity to also participate without fear. So somehow I became forewarned. A question I'm supposed to be expecting from a thematic discussion. So I'm ready with some answers. But let me correct some things, which a simple letter to me would have been able to correct. I was born 1965, March 30. Mr. Jackson here said PAL was formed in the United States of America. I never saw the face of the United States of America from about our mason, builder. I never saw the face of the United States of America until I became a member of the Transitional Legislative Assembly. Do I know of the motivations and aspirations of PAL? Of course I do. But who doesn't know? Who doesn't? Then you have not been here in Liberia, probably you shouldn't be sitting to that play there. So if you say an associate member, thank you for that deference, and I will accept that title of associate member. But by the time I passed, maybe I was just too young. Maybe if I was a little older, I was going to be full member. Then there is the PPP. Young, wet behind the ears, energetic, driven by political motivations for the country. The first real party that I joined in Liberia was the United People's Party. I've been engaged in student political activities at the level of the University of Liberia, at the level of other high schools. We got involved. We agitated along with other students, especially under President Doe. We got arrested at one point and were jailed. We came out of the jail, graduated from the University of Liberia, enrolled at the Louis Arthur Grimes School of Law. Was working at the Temple of Justice while doing full-time studies at the University of Liberia. And then 1989, when the war announced, I was a student at the University of Louis Arthur Grimes School of Law. In any case, I gave reasons, including those of the young men that I encountered, and my own activities that led me to believe I shared in a moral responsibility for the war, and therefore had to do all that I could to bring it to a logical conclusion for the country. Now, I will wait for the questions about the 10 million and the 15 million and the 20 million, whatever else you people want to put together. But let me, before I rest, say something which is very important, Mr. Chairman. I have served in numerous senior level capacities in this government, one of which was National Security Advisor. When you reach that level of leadership in your country, you share in policy formation. The Office of National Security Advisor, as we understood it then, was not to be Director of Police or Minister of Defense or Chief Immigration Officer or General of the ATU. It was a policy formulation position to provide the president alternatives. So at the level of the National Security Council, we recruited experts in various disciplines who will sit, and for instance, if the price of rice was a subject that the president would confront, or a minister has suggested, first of all, ministers of the government and key functionaries were members of the council was chaired by the president, the vice president was a member, and the secretary was a National Security Advisor. So the National Security Office provided president alternative policy. If a minister wanted the price of rice increased, it was the National Security Office, because everything, local and international, pertains to national security. So the National Security Office provided the president an alternative. Mr. President, were you to make a decision on increasing the price of rice, is now being advocated by the Minister of Commerce because of the narrowed perspective they have on the overall project. The net implication will be for the security, for other things. This will happen, this will happen, this may happen, this may happen. We're involved in policy formulation. That is why, as National Security Advisor, I work closely with the Minister of Foreign Affairs on what at the time was the biggest threat to the national security of the country, which was foreign policy and imagery. Now, having said all of that, laying all of those premises, why am I laying those premises? One, as National Security Advisor and a senior member of the government, I hope it is being practiced today. You take what is referred to, lawyers will confirm that, as a fealty oath, F-E-A-L-T-Y, fealty oath. What that does is shows the level of privilege so that you are able to speak and that others can speak to you about the security of the state as freely as possible, so that people can be thinking that as soon as the man leave from here, you're going to carry the government business outside in the street. The second reason is, and that fealty oath covers the individual for 20 years. The government of Liberia can sue you over the course of 20 years if you break that oath. What is the implication of that today? I listened to some of the line of questioning, and I respect it and I understand it. But if I were like others before me, and I don't fault them for it, maybe they have the benefit of not having done that, but if I were to sit before you in search of grandeur, and you ask me some of the questions that I hear have been asked, do you tell the president this? Then I suggest to you, yes, I told the president this, but he did not do it. I am wondering what President Sirleaf now will be thinking as she engages her own security advisors, as she engages her senior officials, that I can't speak to these people honestly. As soon as I walk out of here, they most probably will go straight to another forum and say, this is what the government has just said. And this is what the government is doing. I respect transparency. I respect, but I also respect a certain code for the conduct of governance. Now, having said that, to the best of my knowledge and ability, and in respect of those, because I didn't come here afraid of any question, to the best of my ability, I will provide you as honest as I can answers to your questions. But please respect, whenever I try to draw the line between what I can see and what I cannot see, it is not because I am afraid. It's not because I want to be popular. It's not because I came here trying to say to you and hopefully others that I'm not part of any wrong. That's not why I came. I came to tell you that there are wrongs. I came to tell you what my perspectives are about those wrongs. And I came to hopefully offer suggestions as to how we can correct those wrongs. Now you can ask me, so why you correcting the time you were there? Then maybe by now we not have learned it. One of the problems we have in the country, we don't have sufficient institutional memories. Each new government, each new institution wipes out everything. Don't want to hear from anybody in the past. To the extent that they prefer to go about making their own mistake when we could have learned from others and avoided their mistakes. Our book people don't write books. They don't write their experiences. So we got no reference to look back on and say, oh, they made a mistake here, so we'll avoid it. Most of it, we just analyze, we talk to foreign officials of the United States, especially the United States government. We go to the congresses, we go to the legislative libraries, we read about our own country. Before we are able, sometimes we find things that will never be told here. Yeah, I'm sorry for the long discussion, Mr. Chairman. But now, I hope I have corrected some of this. And if you still want to follow through with a $10 million thing, as important as it may be to some people in the country, I'm prepared to answer some of them. Thank you.
The point is well made, and we thank you for that. This is the first account we have heard of your interaction with our researchers, and if there were any professional transgressions, we duly regret it. At this stage, we take a break. At this stage, with your indulgence, we take a break for 1 hour, and then we'll return.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.